Welcome to this explainer. We've all had that frustrating moment where we suddenly realize that a service or a tool we rely on every day has just become awful to use. If you've been feeling lately like absolutely everything around you is slowly getting worse, I want to tell you right off the bat, you aren't imagining things. And no, it's not an accident. Today, we're going to dive into the structural reasons why the systems we depend on seem to inevitably degrade over time. Because, as it turns out, there is a fascinating, mathematically predictable architecture behind that exact feeling.
So think about your monthly streaming bills for a second. Think about how the content quality seems to be kind of slipping. Interfaces are suddenly absolutely crammed with ads, and yet somehow your monthly price just keeps creeping up. Honestly, you probably thought it was just a streak of bad corporate management, or maybe you figured you were just being nostalgic for the good old days. It really can feel like a personal insult from these companies. But what if I told you it's actually by design? It's not bad luck. We are watching a very specific economic formula play out exactly as it was intended to.
Researchers have actually coined a term for this life cycle. They call it Enshittification, or, if you prefer the more academic term, platform decay. Now, it is incredibly easy to just blame greedy executives for this, but if we take a rigorous macroeconomic look at this, we see it's way more systemic than that. Look, when a corporate entity has a mandate for infinite compounding growth, but it's operating in a finite market, it's eventually going to hit a wall. When a company literally cannot grow anymore by getting new customers and creating new value, the math essentially forces them to transition. They have to start extracting value from the captive customers they already have.
Let's break down the mathematical model behind this, because honestly, it's pretty elegant. Think of the total value generated by a platform as a pie. That pie is divided into three pieces. First, you have the surplus allocated to the users. That's you getting a great show for a bargain price. Second, the surplus allocated to suppliers, like a creator getting paid fairly to make that show. And third, the surplus allocated to shareholders, the corporate profit margin. Platform decay is really just the systematic, staged reallocation of that exact pie over time.
This extraction happens in three distinct mathematical stages. Stage 1 is subsidized monopolization, which is just a fancy way of saying hooking you with a deal that's way too good to be true. Stage 2 is enclosure of the commons, basically building a walled garden so that the suppliers and creators can't escape. And finally, stage 3 is predatory rent extraction, which is where the shareholders aggressively claw back the entire pie for themselves. Let's look at exactly how this diagnostic framework plays out in the real world.
Right, so in stage 1, the platform's only goal is capturing the market. To pull this off, they deliberately set the price for consumers way below the actual cost of providing the service. Think back to early Netflix. Back in 2011, they offered this massive ad-free, high-definition library for $7.99 a month? They were burning billions on content but charging you pennies. They operated at a deliberate, massive loss, subsidized by venture capital, just to build a monopoly and bankrupt legacy competitors like video rental chains. The real product wasn't the streaming service, The product was capturing you.
But once you're locked in, and the suppliers, the studios, the advertisers are entirely trapped on the platform in stage 2, the trap springs. And we inevitably reach stage 3. When you look at modern 2026 streaming tiers, the landscape is totally unrecognizable. Companies like Netflix and Amazon aggressively restructure their features. If you want to avoid mandatory ads now, or just keep that 4K resolution that used to be the default, you're getting hit with really steep surcharges. The baseline plans force you to watch commercials. The gates to the walled garden have been locked tight.
And this brings us to a really glaring disconnect. Logically, if the price of something goes up, you'd assume the product is getting better, right? But the data shows the exact opposite. Between 2012 and 2026, Netflix's standard subscription price jumped by 150%. Yet, their content reinvestment ratio, meaning the actual chunk of revenue they put back into making the shows you watch, dropped by 34%. Your extra subscription fees aren't buying you better shows. They are being systematically redirected to pad operating margins.
Which brings us right back to our pie equation. In this final stage, the great reallocation is complete. The user's slice shrinks down to a sliver, the creator's slice gets reduced to crumbs, and the platform owners take the rest. The total value of the system is clawed back and redirected almost entirely to shareholder equity. Everyone else just gets squeezed.
The source material for our explainer frames this in a truly brilliant way. It says the platform leaves you with a homeopathic residue of utility. Think of homeopathic as a microscopic, almost non-existent trace amount. The service becomes just barely functional enough and just entertaining enough that you don't go through the massive headache of canceling. This relies heavily on what we call dark patterns, where it takes one single click to sign up, but you have to make a phone call and navigate 5 different submenus just to leave. They calculate exactly how much they can squeeze you before you actually break, and they leave you absolutely no more value than that.
Now, it would be really easy to just wave this all away as the annoyance of the modern internet. If Netflix gets too annoying, you can always just cancel and read a book, right? But the exact same financial math and the exact same management consulting playbooks are actually being applied to our critical life-or-death physical infrastructure. Wall Street and private equity firms realize something. If this mathematical model works incredibly well for trapping people in a digital service, it works even better for vital services that you literally cannot walk away from. The stakes here are much, much higher than your weekend binge watch.
To really understand this pivot to physical infrastructure, we have to look at the number 7.1. This is the average debt-to-cash flow ratio that private equity firms maintain when they acquire healthcare systems through leveraged buyouts. Let me break that down. Imagine someone buys a house, but they take out a massive mortgage in your name, and then they force you to pay it off while they live there rent-free. That is basically a leverage buyout. These firms load vital regional hospitals up with massive, totally unsustainable debt just to fund their own acquisitions. And to put a 7.1 ratio into perspective, financial regulators generally consider anything over a 4.0 to be unsafe.
So how do these firms service that massive, unsafe debt? They do it by aggressively slashing operating costs. A landmark study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association documented the very real human toll of applying the Stage 3 extraction to hospitals. Because these aren't just budget line items, folks. They are clinical outcomes. The study found that when private equity takes over, there is an average 11.6% reduction in full-time staff. Because there are fewer nurses on the floor, patient falls spike by 27.3%. Because there's less time for proper sanitation, central line infections surge by 37.7%. The clinical deterioration is undeniable. It's a direct consequence of shifting value from patient care directly to debt service. We also see this exact logic playing out with terrifying precision in the elder care sector. A massive national study tracking private equity acquisitions of nursing homes found an 11% increase in short-term patient mortality. Over a 12-year period, that mathematically translates to 20,150 premature deaths. Because of extreme staffing cuts, these exact same facilities were found to be 50% more likely to chemically restrain patients using antipsychotic medications. Why? Simply because they didn't have the personnel to actually care for them properly. It's the exact same logic as a streaming paywall, but applied directly to human life.
This systemic capture extends incredibly deep into the carceral system too. Private operators create local monopolies, and they effectively trap state governments into contracts that include mandatory minimum bed occupancy clauses. In plain English, that means the state gets financially penalized if they don't lock enough people up to keep the facility full. They squeeze everyone. For instance, look at the prison healthcare provider WellPath. They accumulated over $35 million in unpaid debts to external safety net hospitals before filing for bankruptcy in 2024. The firm successfully extracted the financial value they wanted and left local taxpayers and local medical providers completely holding the bag.
To see just how deep this operational cost-cutting goes to service this extraction, look at how these facilities are maintained. To suppress costs, detained immigrants in some private facilities are paid as little as $1 a day to perform essential plumbing and electrical work. On top of that, a 2026 California state investigation documented absolute crisis-level medical understaffing. We're talking about one facility employing a single physician for nearly 1,000 detainees. That deliberate lack of resources leads directly to severe medical neglect.
Now, you are probably wondering, how on earth our system became so vulnerable to this kind of aggressive extraction? It's a fair question, and it's important to remember that it wasn't always this way. This structural decay is actually a deliberate feature of our regulatory framework. To understand how this became totally legal and normalized, we have to rewind a bit and trace its origins back to the 1980s leveraged buyout era.
You see, prior to the 1980s, federal regulators used a structural framework. They actively blocked corporate mergers because they fundamentally believed monopolies were bad for a healthy, competitive market. But in 1981, the adoption of Robert Bork's Consumer Welfare Standard completely rewrote the rules. Under this standard, Bork argued that monopolies were actually perfectly fine and efficient, so long as prices for consumers stayed low in the short term. This perfectly explains why regulators looked the other way during Stage 1, back when companies were essentially subsidizing those super cheap $7.99 streaming deals. This shift in the rules sparked a massive boom of 1980s corporate raiders using high-yield junk bonds to take over legacy companies. Look at guys like Carl Icahn with TWA or Frank Lorenzo with Eastern Airlines. They practically invented the playbook. They used the target company's own assets as collateral, loaded the company with debt, demanded massive wage cuts, and essentially stripped the copper wire right out of the walls to pay themselves. They left a hollowed-out company behind. The platform decay we see today, whether it's in a tech company or a regional hospital, is just a modern digital coat of paint on that exact same 1980s Raider playbook.
So by understanding this cycle, we can finally see the complete picture. The enshittification of the world around us isn't a random glitch, and it isn't just a few bad managers. It is the logical, intended result of an economic formula. We've traced this journey all the way from the minor annoyance of your TV screen directly to the critical care at your local hospital. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative question. If this three-stage mathematical decay is the absolute inevitable outcome of applying infinite growth models to finite markets, what happens to society when every single system we rely on reaches stage 3 at the exact same time? Keep questioning the structures around you.